Hello, welcome to Active BookStream number 1.2. It's February 15th, 2023. Welcome to the Active Inference Institute. We're a participatory online institute that's communicating, learning, and practicing applied active inference. This is a recorded and archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so we can improve our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome, and we'll be following video etiquette for live streams. Check out activeinference.org to get involved with live streams and other projects. Blue, to you.
Great. Well, this is our second discussion of the book, Governing Continuous Transformation. We are here with the author, Bijan Khezri, today, and we will be discussing part 2 of the textbook. So I think we want to maybe go around and introduce ourselves. I am Blue Knight, an independent research consultant in New Mexico, and I will pass it off to Tyler.
My name's Tyler. I'm a protocol designer and DAO researcher in California. Pass it to Daniel.
Daniel, I'm a researcher in California, and pass it to Bijan.
Okay, so obviously an author really coming much more from the practical side of the world, having been serving on the boards and eventually taking a strong interest in the theory and being inspired by active inference, and in particular the free energy minimization principle, to adopt that and apply it to the world of corporate governance. So hence the book. I very much appreciate that you invited me today, and hopefully being in a having another stimulating discussion. I always love to see how, there's so much work which goes into writing a book. It's a very lonely journey. And when it's one's out and you see actually such a gifted group of people looking at it, reading it, critically reviewing it, and engaging in a dialogue, it's a great gift for an author. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, carry it forward, Blue.
So we are here discussing part 2 of free energy governance. So over the last 4 weeks, we have discussed these last 4 chapters. And so today's discussion is going to just encompass those sections. So a bit of a roadmap. We had some kind of category questions regarding the role of empathy in free energy governance, the role of artificial intelligence in free energy governance, and also on duality management. So starting off with empathy, we got here. So I just actually was, I think, looking up a photo for like top down, bottom up. Like, what does that look like? Top down, bottom up organization and communication. And so like in my photo scrolling, I found this old paper, right? So it's from 2008, and it's about really about empathy and emotional resonance. So this picture I thought was a great picture, and it had perception action coupling and shared representation and kind of like the self and other distinction. And I don't know, Bijan, if you've read this paper, but for me, like, it was a figure that kind of encompassed all these things that we've been talking about in the book all along. And so to quote Bijan's book, he says, "Cognition in the form of world enactment is the purpose-directed, action-centric, and social construction of shared meaning and shared expectations, anchored in the understanding that a firm's environment is a matter of environmental engagement in the form of interaction, revealing significance and assigning probabilities to a bounded set of external unknown states." And I just was wondering, like, about maybe the role of empathy in, like, gaining a shared representation or a shared understanding. So I don't know if you want to flip to the next. There we go. And so, like, here, is empathy required for this shared meaning and shared expectations? And I'm curious to know, Bijan, what your thoughts are maybe on either this, or maybe I know we hear also a lot about the role of emotional intelligence in business success. And so where does maybe emotional intelligence come in to free energy governance? Like, is that also essential, or what are your thoughts here?
Okay, no, I think it's a very good question. First of all, I did not come across the paper. I think it is a brilliant illustration. Having said so, it's interesting to see it puts perception and then action. I put it the other way around. I see the action is really determining our perceptions. But I think it's a very, very good question, because what you're doing is you're opening something which I think, as part of my work, I consider the black box. Because when you look at, I don't like really bottom. I think I said this in one of our previous discussions. I prefer frontline workers. I mean, people who are really in the front line. Having said this, the top-down, bottom-up dynamic you have at every hierarchical level. And effectively, sometimes it's a question of how you laterally work together. So then you open up the black box of teamwork, of how do you engage actually, which is how do you understand each other. And I think that's where empathy plays a very important role. I think that's where emotional intelligence starts playing a very important role. What I have done for the purposes of the book, for the purposes of the free energy governance concept, I really focused on, I think, communication. But there is a lot in communication, which is also empathy related, you could argue, to make sure that actually people hear what you're saying. And obviously sometimes there needs to be an empathetic dimension in it. But what I think the waterfall here is, you start really with a purpose. When you don't have a purpose, then it becomes a little bit fuzzy. But if the purpose is very clear that we want to go to Rome, then there's many ways that are leading to Rome. But as you're going on this journey and keeping actually the team together, keeping the team energized, motivated, of going through a lot of hazards, maybe crossing the Alps from Europe to on the way to Rome, communication becomes very essential. And when you look at the practical side of the work, even when you take a publication like Harvard Business Review, which in my view is one really of the leading business publications, which addresses really current issues managers, company leaders, but including frontline workers are focusing on. And you see that empathy, emotional intelligence, and communication are really critical things in making the most complex strategies work. Because there is no point of being very smart about analyzing where the world is going if you're not able to align and motivate all the resources, all the dots of intelligence in the firm to join this. So I stayed away as part of the work of looking now into the microcosm of communication, of what's happening between, let's say a leader and a frontline worker, how much empathy you show in certain situations to ensure that actually the whole flow is going to work. So I think to summarize the answer, when you look at emotional intelligence, when you look at empathy, there are dimensions you would consider more on a micro level in the way things are being translated, which I stayed away from and really considered it as a black box of how probably the communication is best done in very specific circumstances.
So
that's clear, because it's a very unusual, I think it's a very good question, because it's a question which really strikes the heart of management, and has become, obviously in recent years, a very popular theme. And nobody has ever asked me that question in this context, so I really appreciate it.
And I do remember, I mean, I'm not sure if you've read Human Communication as Active Inference. That was like one of the very first papers that we did at the Institute in our live streams. But, it still is communication as like a necessary tool, and how communication is used to kind of establish that shared meaning and shared expectation. But as for like the nuts and bolts of it, it's still, oh, and then we did another recent paper dealing with communication as active inference, kind of like the follow-up, but by a different author, like the counterpoint to that paper. I can't remember the name of it. That was interesting too.
I would really appreciate if you could send me the links to those papers.
Sure. Daniel, I'm sure remembers, and I can go back through the live streams if I don't remember.
I appreciate it. Thank
cool.
you.
And so just, do you think that in human cognition, we have empathy in human cognition, and it plays a role. Do you think that there's an analog in organizational cognition? Like, do you think when a firm has cognition that there's what would take like the equivalent role of empathy in a firm, if anything, or maybe that's kind of esoteric, or what are your thoughts there?
No, I do think you know, I mean, what is a firm? A firm is a legal fiction, and it's really a bunch of people and a bunch of assets. And sometimes actually the only asset could be the people, let's say in a services business where there's no machinery or anything. So I think it really comes down to people. I think it comes down to leadership. It comes down to the identity. It comes down to the culture. And in recent years, you've seen that many companies, I mean, through their leaders, have paid a lot of lip service to being an empathetic organization, having understanding for the needs of the workers, of the frontliners, of the asset really of the company. So I do think that today I cannot imagine that a firm which is not empathetic and or integrates empathy as an important pillar of the values and the culture it lives, it doesn't have a great chance to survive. And when you look at culture, what is culture in a corporate, in an organizational setting? It's really behavioral benchmarks which determine really what we would expect of people in this particular setting, you know. And I think this empathy today is incredibly important. And by the way, I do think that the concept of empathy has gained an entirely new dimension following the pandemic. You know, when you start seeing people being locked up, when you have two working parents, kids sitting at home, all of a sudden there's so many things to juggle, where a company, an employer, needs to show empathy and understanding for the very particular challenges people face. And if you don't, you will eventually lose sometimes even the best of your people.
So I have a follow-up question on that, and maybe just to pose the question in a slightly different way. So so far we've been talking about empathy in terms of like an individual human cognition, right? And like, hey, that should be an important part of your culture because it allows communication to flow within and without the firm. But I'm curious if there's an analog on the firm organizational level scale. So in the same way that on an individual scale, you're mirroring the motions of another person, of an external individual, is there a way in which the organization as its own entity mirrors the outside world and mirrors kind of its own perception of the environment and what you could call the emotions of other firms or other processes happening in this external environment? It's a very like maybe strange question, but I'm kind of curious, in what way do you think that the firm under free energy governance is receptive and can integrate information in its external environment? And is that different in a way to how people traditionally think of like gathering data about the environment?
Well, when you look at actually, if you were to dissect empathy and what is it really, I think there's two, three dimensions I could instantly think of. You say a person matters, so somebody matters. Secondly, you respect that person. And thirdly, you really you listen. I think the listening part is an incredibly important part. How can you be empathetic if you haven't listened in the first place? So when you look at all these three dimensions, respect, listening, the idea that somebody and what somebody has to say matters is an essential foundation of free energy governance, because free energy governance effectively says even the weak signals bear the transformative potential we need to listen to. So first of all, you need to open all your senses in free energy governance to listen to what actually frontliners have to say, and start with the working assumption that what they have to say matters. Doesn't matter what in what area they address it, to be able to read in between the lines. So that's the only way I could stretch the concept, the dimension of empathy, and really link it into free energy governance by dissecting it into, let's say, these 3 dimensions, what empathy stands for, and then pull it back into the free energy governance framework, which effectively says the strategy fundamentally is a generative process of prediction error minimization. And so you may articulate predictions at the top, but they are only as good as you can challenge them with bottom-up data. And the bottom-up data, to access it, to make it flow from the bottom to the top, probably requires an element of empathy, because my personal experience is the closer you go to the front lines in an organization, the stronger is actually the resistance to sharing valuable information. And the reason is not that people don't want to share. The reason is that people prefer not to stick out. People prefer not necessarily to assume responsibility now for something they say, or even if it becomes a project in its own right that they may have to execute it, but they wouldn't want to execute it. So what you find is unlocking the valuable intelligence, which is at the front lines of an organization, is a management challenge in its own right. And I think it requires very strong communication, and it certainly requires empathy. And the empathy, and maybe now I can close the circle here to your question, Tyler, and what Blue was referring to before. Maybe it has to be more than just an empathetic leader. Maybe it has to be trust in processes, in an entire culture that I feel comfortable about for this to work on a continuous and sustainable basis. Because when we look at free energy governance, this is not like a one-off project. This is ingrained into the DNA of the firm, of saying the future of the firm is best ascertained if we continuously generatively minimizing prediction error. So predictions at the top, but possibly sometimes at the bottom, and we want to challenge those predictions with frontline intelligence.
So just a quick follow-up. As you were talking, Bijan, especially about like the pandemic, and I was there like thinking about empathy and leadership. I was just directed back to the task positive network versus the direct default mode network.
Yep.
And so I think maybe like empathy is the central component in the default mode network. Like empathy, like the default mode network is like the people-centered part of that. And I think like now with the pandemic, like it just like jarred me into like, I feel like we're so off task. Like, I mean, maybe not in every organization, but I think as a society, like we're so much more centered. We're flipped into heavy on the DMN as opposed to the TPN, just culturally, because of the greater amount of empathy that everyone was just required to drum up for people and their circumstances, right?
Absolutely. And I do think what has reinforced it's a very good way of looking actually at the task-specific network or in the default mode network. You're absolutely right. The empathy is part of the default mode. When you look now at the pandemic, it was all about the default mode. I mean, because there was so much misery, so much tragedy, certainly in the first waves, and uncertainty, unpredictability, and our models were overwhelmed because our world models were not prepared to deal with this. It took a year and a half, and we integrated the pandemic perfectly well into an adjusted, a further evolved model, and we developed new strategies of how to deal with this. But one element is, for example, home office. And when you think about how hard it has become for many firms to bring people back to the office, and you could almost say the office is maybe the physical representation of the task-specific network. You know, you go because you're really executing a specific task in a building, and then you leave it, and then you're out of it. So almost there was a certain link in the brain between office and task specificity. I do recall another example, which is kind of interesting in that context, but I don't want to drift up too far. But I do recall that banks introduced, it was kind of only in the 90s, I think, that they introduced that you can have a casual Friday. So normally it was really just you wear a suit, and then you come on Fridays, you can wear casual smart. And I remember somebody was telling me, actually, when you go on the Goldman Sachs trading floor, the person who has a hole in the sweater and all of this on a Friday, that's probably the guy who makes most of the money, because he shows like, I don't even have to wear a smart casual. But a lot of people said when the financial crisis hit in 2008, and which was really exuberance of, all that cheap money, putting a lot of people into misery with debts and mortgages, that this was partly related to the fact that the casual Friday became almost a casual whole week, and it had an impact on how people were performing actually their task and their attitude towards risk. So I do think that form and informality are very, very critical aspects of how an organization works. And sometimes the informal organization, which is obviously a function of the formal one, can be much more important. And sometimes it can be much more important how information is flowing. Most of the time in organizations, coming back to the free energy governance framework, the most valuable information does not come through the formal channels. It comes through informal channels. It may come through a conversation at the water cooler. All these things which are not necessarily documented in the traditional forms of corporate communication. So I think these are probably also the channels where empathy can be best communicated. And I think the big loss of during the pandemic was that while the office work and the office space was maybe very formal and very task specific, I think it was at the same time underestimated how important it is to provide to frontliners, to even to leaders, a source of empathy and exchange, because I think most people were confronted with a terrible loneliness. And so we shouldn't underestimate, and we shouldn't bash too much the physical office space as a very important place, not only where you perform your task, but could be also a source of being energized and receiving understanding for issues which have nothing to do with your job. And more importantly, it's really the side of learning. I do recall when Morgan Stanley CEO insisted that people are coming back to the office, it was really by saying our future as a company is dependent on continuing training people and bringing in young talent who have to learn on the job. How can they learn on the job when the office is empty? So there is a duty in the name of firm survival to keep the firm as a learning site, and that means bringing in the site. So that's a long talk. Obviously, the concept of empathy in the context of free energy governance is not an obvious one, but I think this is an interesting, very interesting conversation. And I do think that we need to dissect what really empathy means for, and then we need to look at what is a firm consisting of people, of assets, but also of the physical space. And I think the space is a very important dimension to consider, and that's where the pandemic is an interesting example of how it can be a source of whatever positive we associate with empathy to provide.
Awesome. So we'll move now into talking a little bit more about artificial intelligence. And you say in the book, you say, in fact, we are challenged not to allow for the human brain's computational limits to solely determine perception and sense making. Instead, outsourcing some of the heavy information lifting to the environment in the form of extended cognition is the essence of optimizing prediction error minimization. The more exponential and hence discontinuous a market environment, the more we need self-organizing mechanisms that leverage the world as a supervisory signal challenging in circular causality the very perceptual content of our predictions. And in reading this, I have been having lots of fun working with GPT chat, as I'm sure you have and many others have been, and really as just kind of a platform or a standing, like a springboard for like what we already know. Like it's a very big cognitive synthesis of like, you know, the whole internet circa 2021 or something like that. And so like this is really a cognitive extension, like our smartphone and many other things. And so I just was wondering what role you might see for ChatGPT or other automated artificial intelligence. I mean, there's no limit to assist us with free energy governance, because I really see like an assisting with the synthesis and integration of information, like at a very large scale, even just now compared to a year ago. So do you see a role for AI in free energy governance or helping us to kind of springboard our leadership platforms?
Yeah, very good question. So let me there's many dimensions to it. Number one, free energy governance, strictly speaking, does not consider making use of AI at the board level. Now, when you look, and let's briefly talk about an organization and applications of AI, you have today, I mean, so many examples from credit cards where you have AI, I mean, which has been now automated in a massive way of how credit checks are happening on the spot. It's no longer left to the retailer, but there's a central system which can authorize the credit card transaction instantly or refuse it. So there has been predictive algorithms being centralized and changing the way certain tasks have been done in an organization. So I would say the application of AI today is very much at the front lines. Whereas it's probably a little bit further up the chain also is if you look at healthcare. So a radiologist is possibly redundant today, but if you make the radiologist redundant because a machine can maybe possibly read the images much better, it may have repercussions of how you're going to start organizing the whole hospital, because who's assuming now what role, and maybe the role of the nurse is going to be upskilled, because on the basis of the machine output, there will be direction to the right doctor to look really for treatment, whatever is the reading from the images. So I think we need to see now that AI starts, first of all, in a very task-specific way, but moves up and all of a sudden has very systemic changes. Applying AI at the board level, I don't see this at this moment. You know, information processing will not be done at the board level with AI tools. I doubt this at this point. When I look now specifically at free energy governance, well, free energy governance, if you look at free energy principle, for me, that is an artificial active inference. And the way Carl Friston has been even applying it to neuroimaging is a machine learning algorithm. So for me, free energy governance is really a machine learning logic in its entirety. Now, when you look at what is happening, Chat GPT is not as smart as a lot of people think. At the end, it's just a language model, and it makes statistically very plausible language it produces, which it doesn't understand itself. So it poses obviously great challenges. So I think that has been a little bit misleading. Having said this, I think it's not misleading to the extent that Chat GPT is an indication that generative intelligence, automated, augmented, is the future. And this is going to come. And I think we will have a hard time as humans to catch up how fast it can evolve and the things it's doing, because it's getting better every day, because it's training on the back of massive training knowledge. Now, what is happening, and that is definitely a challenge for the board, you could ask, how can the board continue fulfilling its most basic fiduciary duty of monitoring company and management if itself, the board, has no means of understanding what the algorithms do? Because algorithms can be potentially very damaging. So I do see that there will be a safety and ethical, a regulatory dimension, which will probably need to be addressed at the board level when you look at it from an AI point of view. Now, so that's a little bit to the question of artificial intelligence and free energy governance. I specifically have not considered any tools at the board level. Now, when you look at what is artificial intelligence really about, it allows you to separate two components which make up a decision. It's a predictive component and it's a judgment component. I think the predictive component can be more and more done, the prediction element, by machines on the back of data. But I do think that it revalues the judgment component of the human. Now, it could be that it's no longer really the top, let's say, leaders, which are best positioned to make the judgment component. Maybe people on the front lines now being empowered by artificially intelligence-fueled prediction models and prediction tools can place a much better position to make the right judgment call. So I think the impact of artificial intelligence on the company will be more distributed decision making, to be really more in real time. Now, coming back to the quote you originally were reading out, the most important element of that quote is what you see today is that most people in leadership positions will tell you the world has become uncertain and it's unpredictable. And my answer to this is always, first of all, uncertainty and unpredictability is a very subjective concept. It's not an objective reality. And your perception of uncertainty or unpredictability is really a function of how good is your world model, how good is your prediction model. So if you're telling me the world is uncertain, you're effectively telling me your model is not good enough of modeling it, and in a generative, actively inferential way, going step by step forward to improve it and make the world less uncertain. By the way, I do believe also for the pandemic was a brilliant example. If you had a world model, which maybe Bill Gates had, that pandemics are going to come, they're going to be massive, and they're going to be global. There's no way you're going to contain in today's world something which started in China, it's going to stay in Wuhan, but it's going to be global. But if you think about it, it started off in 2019, November, December, and people until January, February in the Western Hemisphere still thought this was a Chinese problem. And they weren't prepared at all. Now, think about it. Some people were smart enough and they exploited the business opportunity by going upfront into producing a massive amount of face masks. So when all of a sudden the pandemic hit in March, April, they were the ones making fortunes because governments didn't have the right prediction model and they didn't have enough masks. I know actually the guys who did take advantage of this in Switzerland. I think they made $250 million or something like this. And they because they caught really the government naked. So you see the discrepancy, even governments where you suppose with all the resources they have at hand, all the information they have bad prediction models. So your prediction model determines how uncertain and how unpredictable the world is. And a big problem you have today in companies is that companies do not embrace uncertainty, but they bury uncertainty. A book which puts this brilliantly into perspective is from Agarwal and Avifab. It's called Power and Prediction. And it shows very clearly how companies have developed, as Aguirre said back in the 60s, it's skilled incompetence, where you act in a way which is really contrary to your intentions or what you really want to achieve. And what has happened is that companies have created rules, best practices. You could even argue that putting the CEO in a super dominant position, controlling everything, is a form of burying uncertainty, because you look now to one person and you say that person is going to give me all the answers of the world. Instead, what we need to do is we need to make our models available to testing in the marketplace in a generative, inferential way by acting and generating new data points that make our model in a generative fashion better and better. And as a result of it, our predictions models get better, the predictions they produce get better, and the world will be perceived as less uncertain. And that's really the essence of the quote you started off with. So we have two elements here. One is really the uncertainty element. I think we need to really highlight as a subjective concept, and it's a question of world modeling, of prediction modeling and prediction testing. The second dimension you addressed is the one of artificial intelligence. I do think artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, you could argue, is it really that artificial? Is just at the very beginning. It's going to be exponential. It's going to be faster evolving and spreading than anybody can expect. And I do believe that within 10 years, 70 to 80% of knowledge workers will disappear, and only those people will survive working in any organization that can understand, manage, and complement artificial intelligence. And by the way, there's so many examples you can see how artificial intelligence allowed in an incredible way to get rid of, millions of jobs, already. And even if you think about a radiologist has a very intense training and medical education. And in the book Power Prediction is a really good example. I think it is in that book. There is another great book I recommend on the topic. It's All In on AI by Davenport and Mittal, which gives you a really good overview, good structure, a few good case studies. And you can see that the job of a radiologist can be divided into, I think, roughly 35 or 38 tasks. And when you look at each of the tasks, a machine can do this today. So that job is gone.
Yeah, it's interesting, the level of synthesis. So how much of so for me, the essence of that quote was cognitive offloading into systems that can synthesize and integrate information. How much of that task is what is done by AI? And I do agree with you that we will need to be able to work with the AI, like to understand that synthesis and integration of information that's provided by augmented intelligence systems in order to be functional in the workplace going forward. Yeah.
But you see the big weaknesses what people don't understand. By the way, that quote, when I recall, it's Howie. You guys know Howie? He wrote a brilliant book, The Predictive Brain. And Howie is probably more a structural Bayesian guy. But he's really brilliant in the way he shows that actually what the Bayesian brain is about is really you use the world as a feedback loop. So you can come up with any predictions you want. Let the world, give you all the feedback you need, and that's a very powerful way of how you start in a generative way reducing uncertainty.
Definitely. So I don't know, I guess we should maybe go on to our last set of questions on duality management. So here, Bijan, is it only critical for the board to understand duality management, or do you think at every level of the hierarchy, from the frontline workers up to top tier management and the board, does everyone need to understand duality management and practice this, or is it only necessarily at the top?
Well, I don't think you would explain to anyone in the front line that you have to engage in duality, but because to a certain degree, it's an abstract concept, and I developed duality management really at the very, very top level, almost, dynamic capabilities. The concept of dynamic capabilities in strategy management is defined. A dynamic capability is a non-operational capability. So you say it's some call it also a meta capability. So it's not a task specific capability. So you would almost say when we talk about duality management, you move very quickly into the default mode side of the brain. And what it really is about, I used it in the context, and I think I said it in our last discussion, you can really reduce everything about a company about two dimensions. One is exploiting today's cash flow and making the money. That's really the business you have, and developing the future cash flow stream, which is the exploration. So you have exploitation, exploration. And there have been so many theories about and case studies about, can you do both at the same time? How does it work? And sometimes people said, oh, you do exploitation here, but you create a whole different new thing over there and you don't mix them. And sometimes they don't mix that easily. I don't think companies have that luxury any longer. And I think exploitation, focusing on today's cash flow and doing something new, is it really that radical? Is it more incremental? Is happening kind of in real time. But it requires very strong leadership, because when you think about exploiting today's cash flow is a very hardcore operational activity. So CEOs usually immerse very, very strongly in the exploitative activity. When they're really good, they can also do exploration, and they need to make sure how they switch between the default mode, which is probably more for exploration, thinking creatively about innovation projects, and at the same time managing and optimizing an existing cash generating business. My idea was behind duality management to say the board is actually uniquely positioned because it's not involved in any operational activities really of the company. The board is not involved in running today's business. It can have a great super view of saying where should actually maybe the CEO be guided towards, of maybe emphasizing right now more exploitation or exploration, where people see as a board, when they analyze the business, they can see the problems. That concerns one complex. Second complex I have is financial and strategic control, and they really stand for in-house innovation and innovation you buy by buying other companies or certain things. And the view of the free energy, or the way free energy governance, and this is how the whole section 2 is structured. You have the structural component, which is really how you connect the top and the bottom. The cognition component is really related to how you have an ability to enact your world, create a model. And I always like the Googles, the Facebooks, all these companies who have created massive businesses, but they really created this in an active way. They did not copy someone. They did not do a market research or adapt, but they had a vision of their own, which I think is essential. And the third dimension are the capabilities. And in the capabilities, I developed this duality management as a dynamic capability. And dynamic capability is really a specific meta capability in strategy management. So I think when you look at these two complexes, how much do I focus on the business I have? How much do I focus on the business I would like to have tomorrow? And how much of it is done in-house and how much of it is done possibly by buying it, are forces which sometimes are going against or going in line. And I think the board, in its meta position, supervisory position, being above the executive leadership, has a unique position to practice this. So that indirectly answers your question. I think duality management, the more you go down in the hierarchy of a business, which means the closer you go to the front lines where hard tasks are being performed, the less you have a duality management. You shouldn't have a duality management at all, because people are really focused on very specific tasks. And the further you move up, and the more you have to decide, are you going to do one of this or more of this, you may find a duality management challenge. So it may not be just on the board, but it's certainly on the board when it comes to exploitation, exploration, and financial and strategic control. Now, that's a long answer I gave. I hope you could follow me.
That's great. Thank you so much.
I try to make it simple because obviously, when you look at the very origins of this book, it was originally a dissertation, which started off really in strategy management. And I'm so happy that I found it all the way to the more neuroscientific dimension, and we're talking at in the context of the active Inference Institute. But obviously, when you talk specifically about the duality management side, we are really pretty much in business school.
So going from maybe a more thoughtful to the more practical, can you give an example of how you can reduce organizational friction through this top-down, bottom-up hierarchical coupling? Like, it gets very fuzzy for me, as I mean, even as we're talking about like what levels need to understand duality management. Like I mean, I get that the communication between the levels is key to like organizational maintenance or like the persistence of a firm. But like translating that into some kind of practical terms that I could apply at my firm, for instance, is maybe a little bit more difficult. So do you have any advice for us that are, you know, down here in the nitty-gritty of it all?
So I do think what tools you apply that are practically of relevance is maybe a function also of the size of the organization. So let's start with a really big organization. Take a big insurance company, and you have the board of an insurance company, which will be very respectable people who have probably jobs as CEOs on many different other companies. They come together 4 or 5 times a year. They take major decisions. How can such a board better understand, independently of CEO framing as a filter, what overall is going on? How can the board make the CEO stronger to ensure that the CEO actually is properly connected with what's really going on in the front lines? And one concept I like a lot, I think I've talked about it before, but I think the concept is a good concept to bring as an example again, because it highlights, and then you can think creatively of what other things you can think of. But they are shadow boards. So having a group of young, high potential people who are quite far removed from the very top, that they form a board themselves and have board meetings with very similar agenda items and can discuss what should be maybe the future agenda items. And that can serve as a tremendous source of inspiration from the front lines to the main board, which is sitting on the very top. And that is a wonderful way I see as connecting the top and the bottom and leading the information flow. Companies which have done this is like Total Energy, one of the biggest energy companies in the fashion business, Prada, Gucci. And when you think about it, Prada and Gucci are obviously companies which are living off young talent, people, young designers, something edgy, something new. Because think about it, in fashion, you've got to come up every season with something which is setting a trend. So you're really dependent on being connected to the front line and from creative people picking up what is the next. So I like the fashion houses because they show how important it is to be connected to the very front lines. A big insurance company may not see it, but a big insurance company may be missing what could be the next big thing maybe young people will be asking for as a business model as an interesting insurance market. And so I think that is a really good tool. Now, let's go into small organizations. Let's take the Active Inference Institute as an example. And you're saying, look, we have this wonderful scientific advisory board. You have a wonderful board who is advising you and guiding you how to increase. I mean, I think you have one purpose: to increase the impact of the Active Inference Institute in the marketplace. And you're looking at various tools. You're looking at various engagement platforms. Our dialogue is one of them. You're reaching out through channels to, at every juncture, optimize that. And I'm trying to support this as well, because I really truly believe in the mission of the Active Inference Institute. And I do believe that it is the very beginning of a great movement, because I see that as the future. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So in that regard, you're definitely pioneers. Our community is still very small. Now, here's the question of how you connect the top, which is you guys now, with the front line. And the front line may have really interesting weak signals, which could give you some really inspirational input where you say, we should take it on. And I think you're doing it. You're doing it with a newsletter. You're reaching out. You obviously want to make sure people read it, they engage with this, and you have internship programs. You have a number of ways of how to bring in really the marketplace to challenge you, to improve you, with one and only one mission and purpose in mind: to make sure that the products, the output from the Active Inference Institute has impact, represents the aspirations you have for high quality intelligence that more and more people should connect to. And I think you're doing quite a great job with the limited resources you have by doing all these tools, creating these dialogues. You are acting actually to generate great data points, including our conversations, and the way you then package the output to reach out and collect input from people we may not know at this point, who may connect to the content. And I think this is a form of structure in a very distributed environment, when you look at how the Active Inference Institute is working, of connecting actually the top, which is you guys. The front lines are possibly people like myself giving feedback. So frontline is not always, it doesn't imply is somebody, that's why I don't like the word bottom. Sometimes your most intelligent people in the network may be your frontliners, giving you the right feedbacks and data points. I hope that answers the question and puts it a little bit more tangibly into your perspective.
Most definitely. And I think, thank you for all the nice things you have to say about the Active Inference Institute. It's always nice to get a compliment. And I think that that's it for today, unless there's any more burning thoughts or questions?
Thank you.
Well, thanks.
I always
and
appreciate conversations.
yeah, and hopefully we can have you back as we wrap up the book. We're going to come around the bend, and maybe we'll see you back in a few weeks if you have time to come discuss the end of the book with us. That'd be great.
I will
Tyler,
always
do you have...
have time for you. It becomes a little bit more, I think, towards the end, it becomes a little bit more philosophical. So this was a hard part. I think the next chapter goes a little bit more into the corporate governance side. I think we've covered quite a bit of this. So when I think next one is 3, conclusion. I think 13, chapter 13, which is outperformance and survival as a matter of self-organization, is quite philosophical, I think, as a topic. And I look forward to it. And thank you so much for also taking interest in my work. It means a lot to an author.
Thank you. We will see you next time.
Okay. All the best.
Peace.